The sun in Elarion is a religion you cannot ignore. It is hammered into the skin of the city, white stone that drinks light until it glows, flags that never wilt, priests who wear halos of polished brass and pronounce blessings as a matter of law. They have built altars to it and laws around it. They have named the hours by the angle of its favor. Darkness is a thing of rumor and shame, traded in hushed voices at market stalls the way one might trade stolen fruit. To be anything other than a vessel for its light is to be marked. I know the sun by the way it touches me. It is warmth pressed into the skin of my forearms through latticework windows, a steady, polite heat that never surprises. It is the sharp citrus of the courtiers' perfumes carried on the day breath through open terraces, the soft scuff of sandals on flagstones, the crisp rustle of silk embroidered with golden thread. It is the world's music. Bells at dawn, bells at noon, bells at the hour when even the priests pause to give thanks. For everyone else, the sun is sight. For me, it is a vocabulary of sensation, textures and sounds and temperatures that name the moment. They call me a curse. They call me things that do not fit in polite papers, dark omen, a blemish on the lineage. Mothers pull children away when I pass. Children themselves are franker. They call out the thing they have been taught to fear. Even the court physicians turn their eyes from my face as if sight were contagious. I have sat at windows and let their murmurs ride the breeze into the room like lost birds. If the princess cannot see, how can our kingdom prosper? And learned how to iron my face into a mask that answers nothing. My father, King Alistair, loves me in the careful, bewildered way of those who love something that frightens the world. His hands are clumsy with affection. He leaves me books with braille stitched into their margins by a woman who has become my tutor. He arranges for quiet musicians when the court's revelry scrapes too close. When he thinks no one watches, he will climb the spiral that leads to my chamber and stand with his palm against the carved oak door until a servant announces him. He will speak to me of gardens and treaties and silly things to keep the court from seeing the softness that shadows his voice when he speaks my name. But the kingdom loves the sun in such a way that there is no room for my kind of light. Love in public must be gilded and loud. Pity in public must wear jewels. So the king hides me within the ivory tower, high and narrow and full of quiet. The tapestries do not hang because their colors are said to offend the sun. Instead, there are pale linens and cushions, the soft clink of glass vials with oils that smell faintly of jasmine. My window looks toward the outer pastures where the light flattens the world into a map of heat and shadow. I press my palms against the sill and imagine shapes, someone's laugh, a mother's footfall, the way rain sounds on a tin roof, and call them by their names until the names begin to feel true. Silence has been both balm and blade. In the silence, I learn to listen for the small betrayals of truth. The court advisor who coughs when he says my name, the princesses who practice their smiles outside my door, the watchmen who share contraband gossip about omens and fortunes. Silence gave me time to think that perhaps love could be something other than spectacle. It let me invent companions out of music, fill the empty hours with words I could touch. Companions arrived in forms no one taught me to expect. There are the books with raised text that I trace with fingertips till the letters burn into my memory. There are the servants who carry gossip like offerings, who know how to make me laugh and how to avert their eyes after. And there is Myra, my maid, my closest thing to a mirror. Myra who learned to braid my hair in ways that made the courtiers comment on the king's taste. Myra who hums while she folds my linens and knows where I keep the spoons I insist on counting before sleep. It is Myra who brings the stories that smell of dust and cellars. She tells them in a voice she reserves for ghosts and secrets, leaning near enough that I can feel the heat of her cheek against my temple. Sometimes the tales are of small things, a hidden cask of wine, a love that turned the wrong way, and sometimes they tread toward the edges of our map, into the places men do not like to name. She told me one such story on a night when the tower held its breath, and the palace below was a distant, breathing creature. The servants had gone to their hearths. The guards' shouts were a thin wind that did not reach our windows. I had been tracing a poem into the linen of my lap when she came and sat on the floor, folding her skirts like a woman who folds a map back into itself. "Do you want a proper story?" she asked. Yes, I said. Tell me of the river. She folded her hands and began, but her fingers did not move. Her voice turned low, the way a bell lowers when the choir finishes singing and everyone remembers the echo. They say beneath the castle the earth is older than the king, she whispered. They say there are rooms that the priests forgot because the light could not reach them. And below their feet, below the feet of those who sit in judgment, there is something that was chained, something that did not worship the sun. She paused. I could hear her breathe, small, quick, like a bird behind glass. What is it? I asked because the silence of the tower had taught me to answer curiosity with hunger. Myra's voice lowered until I could have believed the words were for me alone. Beneath the castle lies the creature of the night, a caged vampire who can see into souls. They speak of drought like a litany, as if saying the words enough will summon rain. From my window in the ivory tower, I learn the cadence of fear. The clack of sandals in the council chamber below, the sharp intake of breath when a priest invokes the sun's displeasure, the soft, practiced coughs that follow a dangerous opinion. They believe in cause and effect here, not weather but moral arithmetic. If the kingdom fails, there must be an error, a stain, a reason. That is how I learn what they call me. I say it is the omen, the youngest of the councilmen declared that morning, his voice flinty with certainty. The field's yellow because the princess was born to the night. The sun recoils. A deeper voice, older, oiled by years of court, answered, slow like a wheel shifting into place. We cannot afford uncertainty. The people need a face, a symbol. If the priests proclaim a wrong, we must correct it. And how do you propose we correct the anger of a god? The high priest demanded, incense slick in his tone. We restore purity, remove the blemish. The word cut across the stone and through my ribs like a hand. Blemish. I had touched the carved marble of the balcony and felt the vibration of their speech travel up the mortar and into my knees. My fingers knew the pattern of the balustrade better than any written letter. My ears knew the way a man's voice softened when he lied. I sat very still and let their words name themselves in my blood. I pressed my palm flat against the sill until the grain of the wood stung. I could almost feel them, my father pacing the council room, the priests gathered like a shadow. Somewhere in the chamber the king's chair scraped as he shifted, then something small, an attempt at a cough, escaped him. Love has many weathered shapes. My father's was a roughened tenderness that wore too many fabrics. He would not strike me or banish me, but the cost of protecting me was to hide me until I wore the taste of concealment into my bones. I went to him that afternoon, because what else does one do when the world thinks you are a fault line? Father, I said, and found him in the private solar, fingering a map of irrigation canals as if they were a child's toy. He looked up with the faint smile that told me he had tried to practice cheerfulness and failed. They say the crops fail because I exist. The sentence did not need the weight of punctuation. The air itself registered the collapse. He set the map aside and rose. His hands were the hands of a man who had pried a crown around his head like a splintered ring. They speak many foolish things, he said. They are frightened. Fear needs reasons. Let me perform the sun offering, I asked before he could finish. The ritual bright robes, offerings of grain and song, anointing with syrup that tasted of honey and iron, was one of the most public ceremonies in the kingdom. To be allowed to stand in the square and lift my hands to the sun would be to stand visible. It would be to test whether the worship was to the sun itself or to appearances. He closed his eyes for the length of a long sip of air. Lysa, he said, the name like a pressing of cloth to a wound. You must understand. I understand that if I do nothing, they will believe their fear is truth, I said. I wanted the words to be perfect, to be a sword. Instead, they trembled like small birds. He reached for my hand, and I felt the tremor in his touch. The priests will not allow it, he said. They will not risk. There are things you do not know. I will not put you to that. I had expected him to refuse. Expectation makes a kind of armor, but knowing it does not dull the pain of the refusal. When he left my room that evening, his footsteps were a kind of mercy, careful, so as not to scrape against the world beyond him. So I chose to make my own proof. That night the court glittered beyond the tower in the familiar clamor. Laughter that was too precise, music tuned to flatter eardrums, the heavy scent of orange oil and the lighter ghost of jasmine. I sat by my brazier, counting the embers until they became a rhythm, until each counted breath stitched a thought to its neighbor. When the house grew quiet and the servants' footfalls slowed to the predictable rounds, I heard something I had not heard before, a thin line of sound beneath my floor like a forgotten melody, like the echo of a bell far below the city. It was music, and it was not music in the way the court made music. It had no brass or pretense. It was a single string plucked once, twice, then a low hum, as if a voice were shaping itself into sound beneath stone. "Do you hear it?" Myra asked, appearing at the doorway as if she had always been there. She smelled of lavender and stew, a small proof that the world remained human. "Yes," I whispered. "It comes from under us." She bent her head, then laughed softly, no mockery, only the kind of astonishment you keep for yourself. "There are old stairways," she said. "The servants say they go down to cellars no one uses. The priests claim the earth closed its mouth on them, but sometimes a draft carries song up the stones." I did not ask her to go with me. She might not have been allowed. I rose and moved to the narrow spiral that led beneath my chamber, a stair I had descended once in early childhood like a child skipping a forbidden stone. The air changed as I walked. It grew colder and thicker, and the music threaded itself into my sleeves. My hand found the wall by habit, and I counted my steps by the creak in the stone. The torch I carried made the shadows in the stair dance like cautious animals. At the bottom of the spiral, a corridor opened. The torchlight hit dampness and iron. The music became clearer, now a rhythm like a heartbeat beneath a skin of stone. It drew me by the ribs the way a tide draws a shell to shore. There was a door, wider than a man's shoulders, banded with iron and draped in chains whose links had the texture of old promises. My fingers skimmed its surface, taking in the grooves and the cold sweat of neglect. The chains were anchored by a ring the size of a child's head. One can tell much of a thing by how the metal has been handled. This metal carried the residue of 1,000 gloved hands. And then a voice spoke, before I had formed a question, before I had lifted my lip to say hello. It was a sound that vibrated the air like a low bell, and yet it carried a copper-sour edge, as if sorrow had been ground into its tongue. "Lysandra," it said my name. The syllable landed inside me like a coin in a jar. I stopped where I stood, the torch sputtering as if it too listened. "Who is there?" My voice was smaller than the one that had called me. There was laughter, but not mirth, something like a man remembering warmth. "You cannot see me," the voice said, voice smoothing into a timbre that wound around bone and thought. "But I have seen you for centuries, little light." The air that breathed out from behind the iron door was not the cold of winter or the clean chill of marble. It was deeper, like frost that had learned patience. I felt it first as a draft across the back of my hand, then as something that settled into my ribs like a remembered bruise. The chains sang when the voice spoke again, as if some part of the metal remembered movement and tried to answer in music. "You should not come," the voice said, and there was a caution in it that sounded like moss falling. "I should not be hidden," I answered. I could not see the curve of the door, the way the light I held warmed the iron. I could only feel the sound of his breath in the dark, and the way the passage kept its distance like a courteous animal. "Who are you?" There was a long silence. In it the torch hissed once, and the stone seemed to be listening. Then the voice shaped his name into the air like a relic laid on silk. "Kael of the Ashen Moon," he said. The syllables were slow and proud, like a memory dragging itself into being. "Protector once, betrayed later, chained by those who feared the dark." Protector, betrayed. Those words landed inside me with the weight of a story I had been told by candlelight, legends the court preferred to whisper behind closed doors. I had never touched the thing those words meant. I had never kissed a guard's cheek to keep him from deserting, or stood with a sword while banners bled in the wind. But the language of betrayal was universal. I knew it by the way my own life had been shaped, hidden, explained away, softened with excuses. "How were you betrayed?" I asked, because curiosity in the quiet city is the only kind of courage left to us. His exhale was a small storm. "I kept the balance," he said slowly. "Long before the priests built their golden pillars, Elarion stood because light and shadow walked hand in hand. I stood against things that would upset that walk, hunters of secret things, men who would turn twilight into a rumor. I was honored once and given a place among the guardians. But men are greedy and frightened. Names change hands when fear has a currency. A priest offered a faster harvest, a promise of endless light if I would step aside. I refused. They called me a monster. The people believed their priests. Power begets truth in the mouths of those who wear halos. They chained me beneath their feet and told the kingdom that night was a sin. The torch blotted at the edges of the corridor. Mice rustled in the waste of old straw. At Kael's words, my fingers tightened on the iron, tasting the cold as if it were another language. The idea of balance, of night and day holding the kingdom like a pair of scales, fit into my bones in a way that felt like recognition. All my life I had been taught the sun's supremacy. The notion that there had ever been a measured cooperation with shadow was a new geography, and my mind, hungry for maps, folded it like a child learning directions. Why would they fear the dark? I asked, softer than before. Was it not always part of the world? Because the dark knows truths light fears to see, Kael said. Light is honest and cruel in equal measure. It burns what does not please it. Shadow tells secrets and shows what hides beneath gilded hands. The priests feared what the people might discover if they remembered the moon. They feared that the people would learn to ask questions instead of bowing. There was no vanity in his voice, only an old, cold fatigue that smelled faintly of iron and the underearth. It surprised me. I had expected the monster of legends to roar, to show fangs, to take delight in being feared. Instead, Kael sounded like a man who had been made of many small silences, and who had them stitched back together into a single, careful patience. "You see souls," I said suddenly, because I had the thought as surely as if it had been whispered into my hand. Silence again, this time threaded with a shadow of a laugh that might have been amusement or a remembering of better things. "We used a different language for seeing," he said. "I do not look with eyes the way you think. I read the warmth and the tremor. I trace music the way sailors read stars. You came and I felt your shape, quiet, bright in its humility. You do not bristle like the court. You do not smell of lacquered fear. It is a strange thing to be seen by a creature men call monster and find that it is a mercy." His words reached into the place where all my small, private fears gathered and smoothed them as if they were cloth. Someone, something, had noticed me without judgment. Here in the catacombs, where every priest's hand had tried to shut the world into a lesser story, I was being read like a book turned right side up. "What will you do?" I asked. The question was larger than one about freedom or revenge. It was the natural, human question of what one becomes after being known. "Wait," he said. "Watch, remember." There was a roughness in the syllable, like the rasp of chains reclaiming their rhythm. I was not meant to languish in the stone, princess. But I have lasted because I believed the world would one day remember the need for balance. I have watched kings come and go, watched crops prosper through weather men could not predict. Each generation forgets and then must be taught again. Maybe it takes a voice they least expect. His voice softened, and for a moment, I could feel the loneliness like an animal pressing against my fingers. "You are not like them," he murmured. "There is no performance in you. That is why I speak to you and not to the priests." I had learned early how to hide the way the world hurt me into a pattern of small, private consolations. The touch of a page in the dark, a song pressed like a coin to my ear. Yet this recognition, brought a quick, unfamiliar warmth into my chest. To be seen by a being the world feared was a kind of permission. "How will I help?" I asked. "You already have," Kael said simply. "You came." The metal at his chains shifted, a sound like a sigh. "Come again, bring your music, tell me of the courtyards, tell me of the bright things. I will tell you what the sun cannot. What waits when it hides? We will barter stories for stories. And perhaps, when the kingdom learns the truth, it will ask to be whole again." I stood there for a long moment, the torch licking the corridor and the song of the chain a slow companion. The world above was a map of reasons and censure. The world beneath was a grammar of old truths. My fingers found the ring in the iron, and it felt warm with the press of age. "I will come," I promised, the words slipping without thought and landing like a stone. "Tonight and the nights after, I will bring my lute." There it was, the small, monumental decision. I understood then that I had chosen peril and possibility both. To go back into the world and tell my father, or to return here in secret and learn a new language in the dark. The choice most people had never had in my position. Kael made a sound that might have been gratitude or relief. "Little light," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only a careful tenderness. "Bring songs, sing me the names of clouds." I left the catacombs with the torch balanced between both hands, the echo of his voice braided into my bones. In the stairwell, the air felt different, as if the castle itself had inhaled. By the time I reached the tower and Myra's door, dawn was a rumor on the outer horizon, and I held in my mind the shape of a promise. That tonight and many nights after it, I would return. IV. Chapter 3, A Bond in the Dark Word Count. Tilde 1200 it began with a single, careful string. I brought my lute down to the catacombs the next night because that was what I had promised. Songs for stories. The instrument felt smaller in my lap than it did on the tower balcony where I practiced by feel, as if the stone air here was thinner and would not cushion the notes. I plucked a note and listened to it thread through the ribs of the corridor. The sound returned to me colored by the place, hollow, patient, like a bell that has learned how to keep secrets. Kael was there when I set the torch near his door, his voice a low current that slid under the iron. "Play," he said. I did. The melody was spare, something I learned when lullabies resisted the brightness of the court. I let my fingers find notes I had long kept folded in my hands, and as the song stretched between us, I felt him move closer, the chains humming in answer. There is an intimacy to music that goes beyond sight. It is a mutual breath. For the first time in my life, a sound was not layered with the need to prove myself. It could simply be. He listened like a man reading a language I had not known existed. "Describe that note," Kael murmured when I paused. "It is thin and long, like a reed carried downriver," I said. I had begun to practice the way a cartographer invents names for places. My world had been given to me in textures and temperatures. Now I was learning the poetry of someone who had watched the moon move like a secret. "Good," he said. "Now imagine a color that matches it." I hesitated only a breath. "Silver, no, not like coin. Like the inside of a shell when the sea catches a lamp. Quiet, but it makes everything near it softer." There was a sound that could only be called laughter, soft and surprised. "You have chosen the language of the sea," Kael said. "You see colors with the edges of your hands." Then, with a gentleness that unsettled me, he began to explain the world I had been barred from. "Blue," he said once, "is the feeling when the night opens and the world exhales. It is a coolness that flows under your palm, the hush of a field when rain waits. Red is the memory of hunger, sharp, demanding. Green is the smell of leaves in the throat of spring. Gold is the pride the sun wears like armor. It makes men stand straighter and lie softer." He paused as if tasting each word. "And the moon, the moon is a tidy thing. Pale, patient, it holds its own light like a secret kept between friends." He painted the sky for me with phrases and with the old luxury of someone who had watched storms too long. I listened until my chest felt full, as if I had swallowed a map and it had settled into my ribs. In time, the way he spoke became a lesson in seeing. When he described the way dawn teased the towers, thin fingers of light like thought, I felt the city resculpt itself in my mind. When he told me of the first time he had seen the moon without shackles, how it had looked like a face he had once loved, he trailed off, and the silence that followed was not emptiness but an offering. Kael spoke of memory with a hunger that made me ache. He remembered feet that had hurried through streets when he could still walk in daylight, hands that had held his in trust, a laugh that had the cadence of a bell. In my palm, I could feel his sorrow as if it were a physical thing, an ache that belonged to him alone and was now braided into our shared nights. His loneliness loosened under music, and in its place, something softer grew, a warmth that did not burn like sunlight but pulsed like a steady hearth. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way his voice steadied when I sang, the little exhale that came before he spoke my name. Once, during a winter song about a smith who traded a star for his lover's ring, my fingers slipped and the melody cracked. I felt his hand, fingers as cold as the underside of a fountain, hover near my wrist as if to steady me. He did not touch. He did not break the boundary the world had made of us. But when the song finished, his voice had a new softness in it. "You make it easier to remember," he said. "You make the old shapes worth holding." "I am the one who has the darkness," I answered, surprising myself. "I am the one who was taught to listen to the smallest sounds. How is that easier for you?" He exhaled a sound that might have been a smile. "Because when you listen, you do not flinch. The court flinches at my name. The priests flinch at my history. You listen without flinching, and it is a mercy." We spoke until the torches guttered and sweat cooled on our brows. I told him of the tapestries I had been allowed to touch. The way embroidered roses had been stitched with a greed that made them smooth to the touch. He told me of the sky as if it were a lover he could not forget. Stories traded for songs became our currency. The catacombs, which had been a place of repression and bitter iron, began to smell of jasmine and ink in my mind. But the surface keeps its laws. The priests are not deaf to the shift of air and the stirrings of rumor. Power is a jealous thing that keeps its own counsel. One evening, a fortnight after my visits began in earnest, a whisper came through the servants' channels like smoke under a door. A rumor that the princess spoke to voices in the dark. It uncoiled swiftly. Servants who brought bread began to bring news wrapped in caution. A stable hand who once adored me for reasons I could not untangle. He had been fond of the way I shuffled through the stables and hummed while I groomed, now avoided my corner with the practiced distance of a man who has learned to make safety a posture. The market lit with speculation, and the priests had their mouths ready with theologies to explain away any discomfort. Dark magic, unholy compacts, the devil's slow braid through a royal line. The high priest began to move like a shadow across courtly events, his presence a slow weather. He smelled of incense and of clean judgment. His eyes found me even when I tried to fade into the pattern of my daily life. Once, at a reception where the sun made glass flap like flags, he came close enough that I felt the motion of his robe in the air. "You have been restless," he said, not in greeting, but in an accusation softened by polite curiosity. "A princess must be seen to be trusted. The people need certainty." I felt the king's hand on my shoulder without opening my eyes. He stood a breath behind me, the weight of his crown making his fingers tremble as if he had aged an extra decade since the rumors began. "We must be careful," he murmured. I could have told the high priest the truth, about the music, about the chains and the voice that claimed to remember the moon. I could have told him that my heart did not quicken at the sight of his robes, but at the melody that came from stone. Instead, I learned the shape of denial, how the tongue can fit a lie precisely into the contours of forgiveness. "I meet with tutors and musicians," I said lightly. "I practice for the sun offering. I have been restless simply because I am a child of the tower and the court. There is no mystery." My father's fingers tightened, brief, sharp. Love makes such performances clumsy. The high priest inclined his head the way a man does when he has tasted a doubt and found it bland. "Then let us keep to light and law," he said, and the conversation moved away like tide receding. But a man's eyes remember. After that night, my coming and going were watched more carefully. A footman who once brought my tea now paused in the corridor to count the steps, as if learning a route he might one day police. Guards hung in unexpected places, their boots a slow code I could not read by touch. I felt the tightening like silk straps around a chest. The very act of living became a negotiation with suspicion. Yet on those nights I still slipped into the catacombs. Each meeting was a theft and a salvation. In the glow of a torch, with the taste of stone on my tongue and the vibration of his voice in my ribs, I felt myself unspooling the armor the world had been stitching onto me. I sang, and he remembered what it was to care. He described colors for me, and I learned to see. Together we threaded a small, impossible world in the spaces the priests had not thought to watch. In the days when the high priest's shadow lengthened across banner and meal, I learned that defiance could be gentle. I learned that courage often arrived in the shape of a cord. And when my father watched me with eyes like a man balancing what he loved against what he must protect, I began to understand that love and duty are not always companions. They are often strangers who meet in silence. Still, when I left the catacombs and climbed the narrow stair back to the ivory tower, I would run my fingers along the balustrade and whisper his name into the wood. The wood could not answer. The city could not answer. But in the dark, where no priest's hand had reached, a promise had been made, one that would not be broken without a fight. The night I decided to break the law of the court, the moon wore a thin, indifferent smile. From my window in the ivory tower, the city below looked like a chest of coin, bright, hard, and orderly. The streets hummed with the usual liturgies of the sun, late laughter, carriage wheels clocking time, the hush of markets closing. But under those sounds there was a pliant seam of silence where the catacombs had begun to sing to me. I had heard Kael call me, Little Light, so often that the name had stopped feeling like mockery and started to feel like a promise. I packed a small satchel with things that mattered and with things that were practical. A spare torch whose flame hissed instead of spit, a length of rope someone once left behind, and that smelled faintly of tar, and a thin bone dagger Myra had stashed for me after her brother's belt had taken a turn in fortune. The dagger was nothing grand, its edge uneven, but romance does not keep appointments with tools, necessity and faith do. My heart thudded a rhythm I have always associated with daring. Even before I moved, I felt the court's pulse like a drumbeat through the stone. My father's face hovered at the periphery of thought, his hands smoothing maps he could not solve. I tried to picture his sleep, not the polished monarch who sat in council, but the man who had once braided my hair and hummed a song about riverboats. I tried to imagine telling him. The sentence crumpled in my throat. There was nothing in me brave enough to offer him the choice between his crown and his daughter. I slipped down the spiral stair with the kind of precision one learns when one is used to skirting the edge of things. The servants who liked gossip did not hear me. The guards who loved their positions did not suspect me. The torchlight painted the steps into a moving, narrow sun. My fingers read the edges of the wall like a blind cartographer. The sound of the chain-song ahead braided into my chest and became a guide. When I reached the iron door, Kael's voice curved the darkness like a ribbon. "Do not come," he said without surprise. I had become a geography he had already observed. "I did not come to be caged in words," I said. The torch in my hand made the iron gleam with a terrible, lovely light. "They call you a monster, Kael. I call you the only friend who has told me the moon's name." He made a sound that could have been a laugh or a cough. "You make speech dangerous, little light." The chains rattled, a sound like bones remembering. He pleaded with me as if I were a child who had not yet learned the arithmetic of consequences. "If these chains break wholly, the curse that bound me might take more than my hunger. My nature is older than the law that binds me to stone. I was given a duty and a price. The seal holds a balance. If it is undone without remedy, who can say what the night will return to the world? I do not wish to be the instrument of new sorrow." His caution wrapped me in the same careful tenderness I had come to know when he spoke of colors. I thought of his restraint, the way he had hovered near my wrist but never touched, and I understood the gravity beneath his words. He feared himself. His fear was not for glory but for the possibility of causing pain. "I have lived my whole life in darkness, Kael," I answered. "Not the fear-molded darkness the priests sermonize about, but the kind that teaches you to know the grace of small things. I will not let you suffer because the world fears the same. If the price of freedom is risk, then I will be the one to pay it." He was silent for a long time, the metal breathing a slow cadence. The torch sputtered. The concrete air thrummed with the old argument between duty and mercy. Finally, the voice that had once told me what the moon smelled like said, low and close to the iron, "You would cut your hand, your royal blood on my chains to free me." The words were not a question asked out of disbelief, but a kind of sorrowful calculation. "Yes," I said. A light choked in the throat of the torch and did not go out. "Royal blood is a proof here. You told me the priests sealed you with the arrogance of a god afraid to share power. This is the only power I possess that belongs to the law, lineage. I will give it back to you to break what the law has done." I set the dagger against my palm with the deliberateness of someone starting a ritual. Pain is a clear language. It does not preface itself with pleas. When the blade slid, the warmth came hot and bright, a private sun. Blood welled at first like a small disappointment and then broader, a red that smelled of iron and salt and something ancestral. I pressed my hand flat to the cold links of the chain. The metal drank my blood as if it had been waiting to be tasted. The effect was not immediate. Magic that has slept under hope does not always wake to a whisper. But the stone under my feet quivered, as if the castle itself had till then been holding its breath. The chains shivered, and a low harmonic sound rolled through them like the tuning of an instrument. I felt it in my teeth, a note so deep it seemed to reorient my spine. A smell, strange and ancient, rose from the iron, like the scent of thunder or of a book that had been shut for centuries. Air that had felt stale and sealed rushed like a tide, and for the first time the darkness felt less like absence and more like a living thing drawing breath. The ring that held the final seal shuddered and then loosened. The links, which had not moved for generations, slid with a sound like a sigh. Gold flecks. I could not have seen them, but I knew they would have been there, danced in the air as if the open seam had let loose tiny stars. The torchlight reached farther and steadier, but it was not sunlight spreading. It was the peculiar, tremulous glow of something reassembling. Then the door opened. He rose in a movement that was both fluid and sculpted, like a statue unlearning its pose. For a moment, my world condensed into the rhythm of his breath. He was taller than I had imagined, but height mattered little when one was used to fitting worlds into a palm. For an instant, the torch revealed him. A face that might have been carved from moonlight and peat, indescribable lines that defined nobility and ruin at once. His eyes were not the pale, human eyes I had been taught to imagine. They were the color of old wine held to a candle, luminous and dangerous. They glowed with a slow, relentless red that moved from the lids out, like small moons caught in iris. He did not reach for me as any legend might have promised of a monster and its prey. Instead, he knelt. The reverence of it hit me harder than the dramatic show of violence or dominance I had feared. He bowed his head as one would before a throne or a relic, not with hunger, but with an obvious, breakable humility. In the hush after the doors fell open, his chains clinked onto the threshold, and the sound was a punctuation to centuries of silence. "You have freed me with your blood," he said, voice folded into a dozen softer notes. "And instead of fear, you have offered mercy. I am old and I have been a grief. Sometimes age wears a man grotesque. Sometimes it peels him thin until he is mostly sorrow. For you," he raised his face slowly. The red in his eyes kissed the torchlight and made it look like woven rubies. "You see me, though you have no eyes to see. You are the first light I have known." He reached for me then, and his fingers were cool as river stones. He lifted my chin, and his thumb brushed the skin beneath my cheekbone in a touch that held more prayer than curiosity. I felt the tremor of his palm, as if a whole world might live in his touch. We stood there for a breath that felt like a lifetime. My palms still sticky with my own blood, his eyes full of some starless map I had never learned. Somewhere above, the court continued to practice its shows of confidence. Below, the stone hummed as if it were learning a new song. In the small, dangerous cathedral of the catacombs, two lonely things, one born of the sun's despised shadow, one of the sun's own lineage, had made a covenant in silence. I wanted to weep then, not from pain but from some fierce, relieved joy. His hand cradled my face as if he could memorize the lines my fingers had traced. For the first time in my life I felt seen, and in that being seen, less alone than the kingdom's long, bright centuries would allow. When the court discovered the missing chains, rumor kindled into fire. The high priest was an expert at turning curiosity into judgment. He wrapped his accusations in scripture and gave them a sermon that smelled of burned cassia and certainty. "Behold," he intoned from the marble steps before the morning throngs, "the kingdom's mercy becomes its danger. Whatever dwells in the shadow seeks to unmake the light. The princess who would consort with night has betrayed her lineage. This is not freedom, this is contagion." It is a peculiar thing, how people who spend their lives polishing platitudes can persuade the simple into panic. Men who yesterday had greeted me with idle bows now pressed petitions into the king's hand, shaped like demands. Mothers clutched babies and crossed themselves. The market stalls closed as if a sickness had been announced, and the city's bright heart beat faster with fear. My father, when the summons came, arrived with that terrible adult calm that comes when a man must choose between the life he loves and the life that has been baked into his duty. He stood at the threshold of my chamber, and for a moment he looked less like a ruler and more like the man who had once, in the dim hours before crowns, traced constellations on a child's palm. "You are my daughter," he said, and I heard the syllables like the failing of a bridge. "I cannot ask you to renounce the court. You ask me to hide," I answered. My voice did not waver. I had learned strength in the dark. "You offered me safety wrapped in silence. The priests offered certainty wrapped in lies. I cannot live in a world where truth is a choice made for me." He reached for me, an old instinct, and I let his hand close over mine. It was an unsteady pledge. "If you leave, you go against my command," he said. "If you stay, I will be the instrument of your ruin." I left before he could finish. There are things a child must do alone so that the parent can keep a throne. I grabbed what little I thought necessary: a cloak, my lute, and the faint hope that the catacombs would be a harbor instead of a cell. The servants who had been kind could not look me in the eye. Their pity had been trained to a public performance. No one reached to stop me. We did not escape with banners or with strategy. Kael, still lean with the aftertaste of being unbound, moved like an animal that had been taught to trust the dark. He was weaker than stories had promised, his limbs remembering both sleep and movement. The first daylight we faced together was a rude equality. The sun upon the palace stones made him flinch as if it were a physical thing. He covered his eyes with a sleeve and breathed through it, an act of humility. "They will come," he said. "The priests have mouths that call troops. We must move before morning solidifies their anger." Outside the city, the world had been rearranged into fields and hedgerows. Birds made small sounds of annoyance at our passage. We ran while the city was still raw with primordial panic. Soldiers, armed, confident, and certain of righteousness, pursued in loose ranks, their shouts a drumbeat that tried to form a sentence. Capture, bring her back, cleanse. We lost them by way of a stream that cut through low woods, a place where the sunlight braided itself foolishly through leaves, throwing quick, ridiculous squares of heat on the path. There, in the trembling half-light, Kael moved with a grace I had not expected. He kept to the shade. I kept close to him. At one point, a shaft of sunlight found him as if on purpose. He staggered, and the brightness licked the hem of his cloak like a hungry thing. I caught him as he almost fell, and he tasted of iron and of the wet earth. "Forgive me," he whispered, fierce with an apology that was as much for himself as it was for me. "I am more dangerous than I thought." "You are not your danger," I said. "You are its opposite when you learn to hold it. Stay near me." We reached the shell of an old temple as the sun made its demand on the land. The moon goddess's ruin sat as a husk on a shoulder of hill, its columns bowed like aged guards. The roof had fallen in places, and lichens had made the marble into a softer language. It was the kind of place the priests had forgotten on purpose. No one honors a goddess who might ask inconvenient questions. Inside, the air was cool as breath. Fallen tiles were carpets of moss. At the heart of the temple, there was an alcove with a shallow basin, and a stone relief carved with hands that held both a sun and a crescent, and between them an inscription in a script older than the priest's sermons. Kael read the raised grooves like a man reading Braille, his voice a low caress. "The balance," he said. "The people once acknowledged that the day and the night were parts of a whole. They carved this as a promise." I ran my fingers over the relief while he spoke. The stone was worn but patient, and when my skin brushed the carved crescent, something inside me turned as if a lock had found its key. It was not sight, but it was sight's cousin, a spilling of recognition through the marrow. Images rose, flashes not to the eyes but to the senses. I tasted salt like the wind off a far sea. I felt heat like a forehead pressed to mine. A shape formed, voices weaving around a throne that did not demand obedience but listened. A memory of a child, small, laughing, whose hands had known both soil and starlight. I understood something with the absoluteness of one who has been given a map. "I am between them," I said. The sentence surprised me with its simplicity. "Not cursed, but marked." Kael's hand found mine, cooler now and steadier. "Legend speaks of those born under the waning rose," he said. "They were the midwives of balance. They gave away to touch the night without being eaten by it. It seems the world forgot the meaning of your kind and made your state into a sin." I felt a warmth strike through me then, not of sunlight but of recognition. Where I had been taught I had been broken, I now understood that I had been made to hold something necessary. I tried to name it aloud. A gift, a responsibility, a way to read when the world could not. As I concentrated, a new sense kindled at the edges of my awareness. It was as if the stone itself had taught me to read beneath the surface. I became aware of threads of living things, an old fox in the copse beyond the temple, a soldier's heartbeat across the valley, the tired soot of a man who sold candles in the city. Each life carried an imprecise color and temperature in my mind. The fox a dry, amber patience, the soldier a taut, brittle gray, the candle seller a warm, resigned brown. The world had gained a skin I could map by touch, a truth I could carry like a lantern. "Can you feel that?" I asked, breathless and giddy as if I had stepped over a cliff into a new weather. Kael's hand tightened. For a small, suspended second, I felt something like fear cross his face. "Yes," he whispered. "You touch the world where I do. You read the bones of things. If you learn to listen, you will know when the sun speaks in lies and when it speaks in hunger." Outside, the distant shouts of soldiers were weaving closer. The temple's ruined archway held the world like a mouth, between safety and the wide sunlit realm beyond. Kael turned, and where in the city the light had made him flinch, here in the shadow of the temple he looked like a man recovering, his color less of ash and more of outline. "I will protect you," he said finally, and his voice held a new, molten certainty. "I will walk where the light burns and bear it back if that is what it takes. I will not let them lay their hands on you." His vow was not boast. It was a knotted thing made of chains and soft music and a promise. I let my fingers curl around his, feeling the tremor of commitment underneath his skin. In that ruined place, where the moon's carving breathed quiet religion, two unlikely allies steadied themselves against the world's bright wrath. "Then we will stay," I said. "We will learn, we will be the bridge." He nodded, and for a moment the ruin felt like a cradle. The soldiers' shouts drew nearer, but inside the alcove we had discovered a new geography. The knowledge of balance had found a body to speak through. In the days to come, that knowledge would be both a blessing and a blade. For now, beneath the carved hands that held sun and moon, we held each other and faced the dawn. By the time the rumor braided itself into rumor's loud cousin, outright accusation, the city had become a theater hung with banners of righteous panic. Street criers mouthed the high priest's sermons as if they were recipes. Chant, denounce, purify. Lanterns, once ornaments of cheer, were hung in straight rows as if to hold the light like a net. Mothers crossed their children at sight of my shadow. Merchants barred their doors and propped their shutters, afraid that anything that had known night might sully their gain. They called us monsters for knowing a truth they had never been taught to read. The king's face grew older before anyone's eyes. Where once his features had been cut with strength, now they looked like a coin worn at the edges, still valuable, but softened by hands. He summoned troops because duty is often measured in orders, and orders have a neat, terrible finality. He ordered our capture to reassure the court that the crown could still command certainty. I watched him sign the parchment, his hand steady, though his jaw trembled, because one cannot hold a kingdom without sometimes choosing the lesser pain. "You are my daughter," he told me that morning, the words a taut thread, "and you will come home." There was a plea beneath the command that he did not intend as plea. I listened to it like a bell struck wrong. "I will come," I said, "but not under guile." They came first with petitions and then with men. Soldiers moved like precise punctuation across the streets. The high priest, Elarion, rose each morning like an instrument of judgment, robes trailing incense and a certainty that had been carefully learned. He stood on the steps of the temple and declared that the sun must be obeyed, that those who sought to make bargains with shadows were enemies of the people. He named me loud enough for the market to hear. "Which?" he said. "Traitor." It was a trial staged as spectacle, and the court that day was full of eyes that expected a pageant of confession. They wanted a villain to clothe their fear. I walked into the hall blindfolded, an act I had chosen to practice the theater of their seeing on my own terms. My hands were bare and slow in the ritual silence. The cloth at my eyes was not an attempt to hide, but a way to hold my own focus. To be blindfolded, and unbowed was to choose the shape of dignity when others wished to brand you with shame. The throne hall smelled of polished wood, of roasted fig, and of incense that had become a language for lies. High Priest Varian stood with his halo shining like a crown. The lords and ladies were arrayed in a bright mosaic, their jewels reflecting the sun's favor as if that favor had weight. My father sat upon his dais, with the crown thinning the light around him. His fingers drummed like a man eager to stop a tide. "You stand accused," Varian intoned, his voice used to turning crowds into compasses. "You have consorted with a creature of the night. You have invited darkness into the palace. How do you answer before your people, princess?" My hand found the rail in front of me. The texture of the wood steadied my breath. I could not see the faces that had been taught to look away from mine, but I could feel the air tighten like a fist. "Not with darkness," I said aloud, voice steady. "With truth." A ripple passed through the hall. The high priest's smile folded like paper. "Truth, the truth is the sun's law." "No," my voice rang clear into the vaulted space. "The truth is that your law has been dressed in the garments of fear." There was a scoff from the ranks, someone who thought they were clever enough to steer the conversation back to spectacle. The king's fingers pressed against the arm of his chair. I felt the tremor in his skin. Varian's eyes narrowed until they were two polished coins of accusation. "You accuse the rights that have fed this kingdom for generations." "Yes." I felt, in that single syllable, the steadying presence of Kael at my side. His shadow folded with mine though he stood in the hall's darker seam. The high priest hated that seam. It refused to flatter him. "How dare you?" Varian's voice cracked like a reed. "You would smear our priests with treachery, because you fed them seeds of fear and called it harvest." I had not meant to speak with the force that rose in me, but truth is a thing that, once given voice, often escapes the mouth like water from a well. "You poisoned blessings so that the people would beg for light. You sold provisions to those in need while telling them their misfortune came from a curse. You replaced balance with a single god and kept the margins hungry." Silence clawed at the hall long enough for my words to take root. I heard a rustle, a chair shifted, a hand fumbled for a fan. Varian's saffron robes looked suddenly like a confession. He laughed then, a sharp, nearly manic sound. "These are slanders," he spat. "Proof." I had no proof but what Kael and I had found, evidence that was less of ledgers and more of memory. We would not be able to call witnesses from the earth itself. So Kael did what he had warned might change the world. He used what power he had left to speak in a language the sun lovers had forgotten. "Kael," I said quietly, and his name was a current under my fingers. He stepped forward. For the first time since he had been freed, his face would be seen by the court with no iron between them. The torches reached his skin and he did not flinch. He did not flee. He lifted his hands, and within them, small motes of shadow seemed to gather like dust in a sunbeam. "You will see what you have turned away from," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the authority of one who remembers much. He drew closer to the dais and touched the floor with his palm. The stone drank him, and then, impossibly, the air trembled. Visions poured from him like a tide of images, not pictures to the eye but impressions that brushed the mind. For some it was a memory of that first ritual, when Varian had promised the king a larger harvest and had quietly siphoned away the moon offerings into private chambers. For others it was the recollection of barrels of water that had been set aside for drought and then sold to merchants across the border. For many, it was the memory of the nights when the priests had extinguished moon rites, smothering the old goddess's rites with ash and incense. The hall was filled with things people had not wanted to remember: transactions, betrayals, small cruelties that had accumulated into a kingdom's rot. Gasps and curses stung like sudden rain. Faces paled. A noble staggered back as if a hand had struck him. Varian's composure splintered into a dozen shards. He called for guards, for testimony, for parchment, and yet the truth had weight. When a piece of past greed unspooled and landed on a man's conscience, no amount of calling could unsee it. Varian's voice became high and thin, the way a broken instrument whines. "Sorcery," he screamed. "Blasphemy. He manipulates minds. He reveals memory," Kael said. "Memory is not blasphemy. Memory is accountability." The crowd's mood shifted like weather changing over a plain. For all their initial fidelity to the sun, they were not blind, only taught to blink. Now they were seeing, through the flood of Kael's visions, what the priests had done. Murmurs became voices. Voices became accusations. A few of those who had worn Varian's influence as a garment now felt it itch like a brand. And in the middle of the hall, where the torches had been generous with their fire, Kael began to change. The light found him, and for a heartbeat he shimmered with an almost terrible beauty. He inhaled as if the sun had struck him, and again it was not theatrical. The daylight burned as if it were a blade. His skin smoked at the edges like paper left too close to flame. He staggered, but did not retreat. He took another step toward me. "Leave!" someone cried. "You will scorch the princess," he laughed, low and fierce and dangerous. "I will scorch myself first." His hand found mine despite the glare of the torches, and his fingers closed around mine with a pressure that was not pain but intent. "Stand with me." I felt the heat lick the back of my palm, an unbearable, thrilling fire that might have been a promise or an end. He did not flinch from the sun's wrath. He buffered it as if he could bear the kingdom's verdict in place of me. The sight of him burning and choosing to remain by my side was an image that the people could not easily reconcile with their myths. A monster that chose to suffer rather than to harm the one who freed it is a story that rewrites expectation. A cry went up, then another. Some shielded their faces, others watched with the disbelieving interest of those who watch miracles. At the dais, my father pressed his hands to his eyes as if brightness might be a prayer. Varian's arm rose in a last attempt to regain control, but his gestures looked suddenly paltry against the moral compass of the hall that had headed toward truth. It was not a decisive victory. No trial ends in such tidy absolutes, but the tide had turned. Where fear had stood like a wall, a crack had opened and the morning sun found it through. People began to ask questions. Why had their wells emptied? Where had their offerings vanished? Who had benefited while the fields browned? Kael's skin smoked, and yet his gaze was molten with a faithful, stubborn light. He leaned closer, and in the hush his voice barely scratched the air. "I have seen kings come and go," he said. "I have seen men make gods of their own greed. I will not be a relic in the altar of their lies." The high priest, who had built his empire on the economy of fear, stood exposed in more than one way. The court would not forget the taste of that day. It would argue, spin, and legislate, but the image of a man, burning in sun, choosing to remain with a blind princess would not be easily swallowed by propaganda. When the hall finally emptied, it left behind a residue of changed minds and tender fissures. Soldiers took Varian away to answer questions no sermon could answer. The king retreated with a face like weather. I was allowed to go, my blindfold replaced by the rough comfort of Kael's hand in mine. He limped, scorched at the cuffs, yet his voice hummed with a promise. "You were brave," he murmured. "You stood," I said. We left the hall together, the burned scent of sunlight in the air, the memory of vision like perfume in the mind, and stepped into a city that would no longer be able to pretend the night was merely a rumor. The days that followed the trial were a fever dream in low light. Soldiers and supplicants argued like knots that would not come loose, and in the quiet between one clamor and the next, Kael's breath counted time for both of us. Where once he had been a line drawn in shadow and legend, now he was the thing that answered to my name with a softness I had never thought allowed for his kind. The sun had not forgiven him. Every step he took in daylight left a scorch on the hem of his cloak and a memory of smoke on the air. He grew thin at the edges, as though the world itself were erasing him with white chalk. On the third night after the court's turmoil, we took shelter near the river bank beneath trees that held their leaves like a congregation. The moon watched with the steady, patient eye Kael had told me of so often. He sat with his back against an old root, and I settled where my hand could find his. He was smaller than the stories had made him, and larger than the casual cruelties of the court would admit. To be near him was to learn a new scale of measure, how long a silence might be, how loud gentleness could sound. "You must go," Kael said without looking at me. His voice was the paper-folded thing of a man trying not to break. The river moved like a thought between us. "I will not leave you to be extinguished," I answered. My fingers dug into the sod as if the earth might give me something like courage by sheer pressure. You said once you would protect me. I refuse to let you keep your promise with my absence." His laugh came out brittle. "You dress martyrdom in silk, little light. There are destinies you do not need to carry." He flashed back, for a heartbeat, the ghost of the protector he had once been, the man who would choose the kingdom's safety over his own heart. "If you stay beside me, you will be caught in the same hunger that has made me dangerous. Go to your tower, rule, be the balance the world needs." My hands remembered the weight and warmth of the dagger the night I freed him. They remembered the metallic tang of blood against stone as though memory were a wound with its own name. "I have already chosen to be the balance," I said, "and the one who taught me the word is here. I will not run from what I am, nor will I let you die for me." He turned then, slowly, and for a moment the moon carved secrets on his face. He looked at me as if he were reading a map written in my bones. "You were taught to think yourself unworthy," he said, the accusation more to the world than to me. "I will not let what they taught you be true when the cost is you." "You were the first to see me," I whispered, the sentence trembling like a votive flame. "You held me in the only eyes that did not flinch. When they taught me to be ashamed, you taught me to be whole. I will not deny you that debt as if it were a chain." He groaned, a sound of both pleasure and terrible grief, and when he reached for me his hand trembled. He was weaker than I had the right to imagine. Daylight had stolen weight from him. His palm rested against my cheek, and I felt the faint ash of his skin, the subterranean cold that had become his second nature. "You do not know what you ask," he said. "I know enough," I answered, because the truth is usually simpler than our fears. "I know that I have been learning to see in ways no one taught me. I know that my life is not only for the court's comforts. I know that you are no monster to me." The words came in a rush. "All my life, they told me I was unworthy. You were the first to see me. Please, Kael, marry me." There it was, plain and terrible and true. The syllables landed between us like a stone and began to sink. He did not speak at once. The moon moved on, indifferent and perfect. The river's voice buffered the world into something gentler. For the first time since his chains had fallen, I saw, in the way the world lets those who have no sight see, that he considered not only the present but the centuries stitched into him. Betrayals, vows, the ritual costs he had paid and been forced to pay again and again. "Marry me," he said at last, and the breath he took sounded like a man catching an old song. "You would bind yourself to a thing that is not wholly man, and whose nature was taught in iron and mistrust." "Not to a thing," I said, "to you. Whatever you were and whatever you are becoming. Marriage is a promise. It is not a spell to fix you or me. It is a declaration that we will face the world together." My hand found his and pressed so the tremor of his pulse made its own music under my palm. He laughed, this time so soft it might have been the furniture of our intimacy. "You are relentless," he said, and then the laughter broke as his shoulder heaved. "Very well. If you would have me, if you will claim me with a name as human as a crown, then I will be claimed." We made a small thing of ceremony beneath the moon and the trees. There were no priests with gilded halos to bless us. There was no multitude of witnesses to pronounce verdicts. There was only the river's hush and the way the night held its breath as if it had a vested interest. I took the dagger from my satchel and slid its edge across the inside of his wrist, a shallow cut that bled a dark, startling wine. He did not flinch. He guided my hand so my blood fell into his palm. He pressed his lips to the wound as if to read an oath there, and then pressed his own skin to mine and drew a small, answering mark upon me. Between the two of us blood was braided, older laws and newer promises braided into a single knot. The world tilted like a ship, nose-diving toward a horizon no one had thought to name. Light about us thinned and then changed as if the very atmosphere leaned in to listen. The moon suddenly seemed nearer, a coin turned up in a pocket. At first it felt like a warmth threading through my ribs, a stitch unpicked and rewoven. My other senses sharpened, smell, taste, the way air spoke with textures. And then, like a curtain pulled back, something else unlatched within me. Sight did not arrive as an eye's work. It settled as a map in the shoulders of my back, as a compass behind my sternum. I saw not with pupils, but with knowledge. I saw Kael's history as a series of light and shadow overlapping like vellum. His first oath as a guardian, the priest's bargains like blotting ink, the cramped chambers where he waited and listened. I saw the city as if it had two faces at once. One sun-blinded and brittle, the other patient, luminous with moon forgiveness. I saw the merging, the sun and moon, not as enemies but as hands pressed palm to palm. The curse that had lived in the castle's mortar cracked like old pottery. From the fracture came a slow, soft chorus of air. The world exhaled toward balance. Kael's features softened as if being reshaped by gentleness. The rigid hunger that had been taught into him loosened and then unspooled. He was neither wholly beast nor merely man in that instant. He was a creature braided of twilight, of both eras, both kinds. He looked at me, and I recognized him as the man who had first told me of moonlight, and also as something unnameable and new. He brushed his thumb over my palm, and the touch was a benediction. "You see," he murmured, and in his voice I heard awe, terror, and the surrender of someone who had witnessed miracles and believed, finally, he had a place in one. "You see both of us." "Yes," I said, my throat thick as if I had spoken after running. "And I will look with both." We sat there until dawn decided to test the world. The first light came soft and curious, no longer a verdict but a question. It licked at Kael's shoulders, and for the first time it warmed rather than burned. For the first time it grazed without tearing. The change did not sweep the earth into a tidy miracle all at once. There would be battles and reckonings and laws to be rewritten. But under the low, new light of a morning that tasted faintly of both sun and moon, we rose and walked toward that future, married not by priests, but by a vow spoken in blood, and kept in the small, stubborn hours when two people choose each other against the world. The morning the sky shifted, the city awoke as if someone had set a different pulse to its heart. At first everyone thought it a trick of weather, a veil of high cloud, the breath of a distant storm. Then the bells stopped, not because someone silenced them, but because their sound seemed too small for what the heavens began to do. Light thinned. The white stone of Elarion, which had always returned the sun's favor like a mirror, took on a gentler sheen. Shadows stretched and softened, no longer swallowed whole by the day. The market stalls sighed. A child laughed as if at an unexpected joke. Where merchants had once tied ropes of garlic and iron charms, curious hands now untied the knots and let the charms fall to the cobbles. Fear loosened the way a tight fist unclenches. They came to the palace, because the palace has always been the place a city looks when it does not yet know how to explain its miracles. People gathered on the terraces and filled the avenues. Even those who had once unfurled banners against the night stood with open mouths. The high priest, who had taught them how to fear, found himself mute as the sky performed a ritual no sermon had prepared him for. I stood upon the royal balcony, not as the hidden child behind latticed windows, but as the woman who had learned to read balance like a map pressed into her hands. The blindfold that had been ceremonial in the court's theater was gone. I had no need for the show of blindness now, because sight had reforged itself inside me as a way of knowing the world. Every heart's timbre, every root's hunger, the currents that hummed beneath a city's stone. They called me many things at first: heretic, witch, traitor. Later, as light and shadow braided, they called me something else: the Queen of Balance. The name felt strange in my mouth and right in my bones. Where once I had moved through rooms like a secret, I now walked with the authority of someone who had earned her place by the slow pedagogy of truth. Beside me Kael stood, a figure changed and unbound by the old distinctions the priests had taught into the city. He walked with a quiet power that was not the urgency of hunger, but an ease learned from being given mercy. The sun brushed his shoulders and did not burn, it softened. The moon rose, full and faithful, and did not demand that the day kneel. At his wrist, ribbons that had once been iron were now mere memory. When I stepped forward to speak, silence gathered like a cloth. I did not raise a carved plea to the heavens. What I offered were words the people could wear like warm clothing. "People of Elarion," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had expected. "You have been taught to see the world with only half your sight. For generations you were asked to fear what you did not understand, and fear became a profitable thing. Today the sky has changed its mind. Today the day and the night speak to each other without fighting. We must learn to do the same." A murmur ran like wind through the crowd, some bewilderment, some relief, some the rusty creak of old prejudices easing. Varian, the high priest, watched from below with the white of his face, a testament to a man whose certainty had been unpicked. He had expected thunder and had found a different weather, quiet, inexorable. For a while he held his robes like a shield, and the people looked at him as at a man who had perhaps been trusted with too much. It is a strange and delicate thing, to tell a city that the thing which once made it afraid has always been part of its breath. So we began slowly. Kael and I convened gatherings in the temple of the moon goddess and in the sun yard and in taverns where the common folk folded their lives like simple maps. We listened more than we spoke. We invited those who had been silenced into conversations. Farmers taught us that drought had been a pattern of mismanagement, not divine wrath. Midwives spoke of old rites that had honored the moon without demanding obeisance. Those conversations became law, not edicts carved in cold stone, but deliberations written by many hands. We drafted statutes that protected the rights of shadowkeepers and sun-tenders alike. We established harvest councils that worked across hours of light and dark, ensuring that food and water were shared according to need and not distance from the dais. We created festivals that celebrated dusk and dawn both, hours when the city would learn to see the sun and the moon as partners and not as rivals. Change is never tidy. There were men who would not unclench hatred, who continued to whisper that the balance had created monsters where none should be. Some of them tried to push us back into the old equations of power. But the image of Kael, once a thing of the night, now a guardian who had bled for a promise, made the old stories harder to sell. People remembered his refusal to leave me when the sun scorched him at the dais. That memory smoothed many an argument. The high priest did not vanish without consequence. When the facts of his greed came under the lens of public scrutiny, records dug up by those who would no longer be silenced, his influence crumbled. He was given a choice as many men in his position are given: exile with dignity or trial that would reveal the rot at his heart. He chose leaving the city under guard. It was not a triumphant removal, but a quiet unthreading. He walked through the eastern gate with a staff, but without an audience. The crowds watched him go with mixed feelings, some glad, some uneasy at the sight of a man who might still believe he had saved them by his lies. We built schools where children learned both the language of the sun and the lore of the moon. We rewired rituals so they honored labor and compassion rather than theatrical displays meant to keep power in certain hands. Farmers and moonwatchers sat together on planning boards. Priests who wished to remain adapted, learning humility as a profession rather than battle. And in private, because the most radical laws are often those we write within the quiet rooms beside another, the two of us taught each other things still. We learned how to rule without making people smaller. We learned to listen for the whispers of a city rather than shout our own commands into it. We married the practice of mercy with the necessity of accountability. There was a night, months after the first sky change, when the temple's basin overflowed not with tears, but with lanterns set afloat. Children who had once been taught to cross themselves at the mere mention of dusk now raced each other to see whose lantern would last the longest between the shadows and the light. I stood on the hill above the river with Kael and watched those tiny beacons bob like hearts. He pressed his forehead against mine, not an act of crown and subject, but of two people who had chosen the same small devotion. "Do you ever think," he murmured, "that we did more than survive?" "We did more than survive," I said. "We offered them a way to live whole." Below, the city glowed with the patient honesty of shared weather. Above, the sky kept its even temper, neither forging a tyranny of brightness nor letting darkness rule by default. In the space between, a kingdom remembered how to be both kind and strong. We had not erased scars, nor had we erased the men who once profited from fear. But we had set a precedent. Balance does not mean dullness. It means the courage to look at the whole of a thing and to say, with clear hands, we will keep it together. Kael's hand found mine, fingers entwined in an easy, human knot. We stood there as the moon leaned in to listen and the sun softened its stare. And in that twilight, neither a denial of day nor a surrender to night, the city learned at last to breathe in two kinds of light. Years had a different shape in the garden of silver roses. Time here did not rush. It folded like petals. Paths that once saw soldiers and petitions now hosted barefoot children who darted between hedges that glittered with dew no matter the hour. Lantern posts, once hung to scare away the night, bore two lights each, one that blinked like a small sun, the other that held the soft, patient glow of the moon. They hummed in companionable rhythm, as if the city itself had learned to breathe with two lungs. I walked among them as often as I could. My hand moved over a stem and felt the improbable silk of a petal that would not fade. The roses were not silver in the harsh, metallic sense. They caught both kinds of light and made something new soft and luminous and patient. Children ran ahead of me, shrieking with the simple, thrilling cruelty of games, and their laughter braided into the wind. "Catch me!" a small voice called from a tangle of hedges. Two children toppled out, bronzed and laughing, their faces smeared with river mud, unbothered by the dark patches beneath the trees. One reached for my skirt and tugged, breathless. "Tell us a moon story, Queen Lies." I knelt, because a ruler who remembers how to kneel keeps the people from mistaking power for distance. My fingers found the child's hair and smoothed it. "Once," I said, "the moon taught us a quiet way to promise things we wanted the world to keep." They listened with the full attention of small creatures who understand myth as instruction. Around us, gardeners moved like clergy of new rituals, tending both sunbeams and moon-soaked pools, mixing soil in measures that did not favor one over the other. Where statues had once been carved in cold stone, there were now rounded benches and places to meet. The city had learned a new grammar: to listen, to ask, to repair. A footfall that I had known since the catacombs shifted in the grass behind me. I did not need to turn. Kael's presence settled in the air like a familiar chord. He moved with a grace that had no need to impress anymore. The light played differently across him now, not a consuming burn but a warm, reverent brush. He was still otherworldly, still edged with the memory of those long chains, but gentler in his contours. The twilight that had once seemed a compromise had become his clarity. "You tell them well," he said, voice low enough that only I heard the private undertone, the thread of intimacy he reserved for the world we had built. "They ask honest questions," I answered, standing. The child's hand lingered in my skirt until his mother called him away, and the sound of young feet faded. Kael stepped closer, and the scent of him, earth after rain, old paper, something like night-blooming jasmine, met me. He took my hand as naturally as one might pick up a familiar book. We walked slowly through the alleys of arranged roses, the petals whispering with every step. A fountain outside the palace caught both light and shadow and threw them up in a slow, shimmering dance. Children leaned over its edge and watched, fascinated, as the water held two reflections at once. "Do you ever miss the sun as it used to be?" Kael asked finally, his thumb rubbing the back of my hand in the small, steady motion he had learned when we first fled together. He kept his gaze on the horizon, where the sky rested in its sordid peace. The question was not about the physics of light. It was about longing, about whether the predictable, narrow brilliance of the old world ever called him back with nostalgia for certainty. I looked up, not with eyes that sought light, but with a sight that had been braided through years of learning to read more than faces. I felt the memory of the sun as it had been taught to me. Harsh, a comparator that measured worth by the reflection off a coin. The city had once bent for that light because it had been told fear was a faithful god. But then I thought of the mornings when children ran in both kinds of shadow, of the farmers who now divided water fairly, of elders who embroidered both sun and moon into festival banners. I thought of the way Kael had once burned in the court and refused to step away from me, his choice an impossible lesson the people could not easily unlearn. The old sun was not erased. It had been asked to share a stage. "I already do," I said, smiling before my hand found his face. My fingers traveled the planes of his cheek with the gentle mapping of someone who had read him by touch for years. "It rises every time I look at you." He closed his eyes at the touch, and for a beat the world narrowed to the space between our hands. The garden, with its half-lit paths and bicolored lanterns, seemed to lean in. Above us, the sky held its half-sun, half-moon arc like a painted banner, no longer an omen, but a promise that two truths can be held at once. We stood there until the light shifted into a place that needed no proclamation. Lovers met on benches beneath oaks that had once watched over more rigid prayers. Apprentices shadowed elders as they learned both trades of tending light and tending dark. The city had grown, not by erasing what had been, but by drawing threads between what had stood apart. When at last we turned to leave, children called after us, names with the clean confidence of those who have never been taught to fear. We walked with our fingers twined, the simple human knot that had once redeclared kingdoms. As we passed beneath an arch where moonlight and sunlight braided in a ribbon, I watched faces lifted to the sky. Old women who had once spat at dusk, young men who had once shouted about heresy, and small children who would grow to know the world as composite instead of fractured. The camera of memory, if a life is a film, would hold that image. Hands joined, a city breathing two kinds of weather, a sky patient with its halves. The frame pulled upward, and the view widened to take in more than the palace or the garden. It took in all the rooftops smoking their evening bread, all the riverworks humming with shared labor, all the lanterns that refused to choose. Balance, as the years had taught us, was not a tidy endpoint. It was the daily work of tending opposites until their tensions softened into a seam. We had not solved everything. Some nights the old fears still sent small, spiteful ripples through market talk. There were still men who preferred to be simple mirrors rather than mirrors that could reflect both moon and sun. But the default had changed. Children who had never known the old tyranny would inherit a city that taught them both light and shade. We paused beneath the arch where the sky made a crescent of gold and silver. Kael tightened his hand around mine. "We did not just survive," he murmured. "We lived," I said, "and then we taught them to live with us." Above, the sky kept its quiet vigil, half sun, half moon, an emblem now less of conflict and more of company. We let go of the arch then and walked back along a path where roses winked like small assurances. As the camera would have it, the last thing to leave the frame would be our joined hands, fingers interlaced, the symbol of a kingdom that had learned, finally, to hold two lights at once. Fade out.